Okay, put my phone on do not disturb here. All right, we are up and running. Sorry about that clipping on the mic there. I didn't adjust it beforehand. Excellent. Welcome to Logan Reads Live this lovely, frightful Friday. We are going to be returning to the turn of the screw. But of course, Logan Reads Live is presented by Rosalyn Jane, and we are featuring the Miranda Jumpsuit, which is perfect for a day out or a special occasion. It features a wide leg, high neck, and long sleeve silhouette with an elegant and unique print. Comes in three colors, and the design is flattering and comfortable, ensuring you look and feel your best. Of course, there is a link in the description where you can go and find the Miranda jumpsuit and a link for rosalynandjane.com where you can find the beautifully curated collection of women's clothes. Now, we have something special here today. So, we have been talking about the new book, The Time Speaker, a dark fantasy adventure by Brit Stanford, which is out today. And of course, there is a link in the description where you can go to Amazon and get that book. But I'm going to read a little excerpt from it for you now. Do demons deserve an answer to prayer? Really, Wynne should have stopped praying at 8 years old. But he hadn't. He kept right on praying, even though a part of him knew the gods only wanted him dead. And yet, he held an answered prayer in his hands. The rough paper trembled between his calloused fingertips, the elegant swoops of black ink giving him everything he'd ever wanted. He tried to ignore the wordless whispers, the unwanted energy swelling in his chest. Too late, the energy leaked from his fingers, curling the paper's edge, making it brittle, infusing the tiny fibers with rot and decay. Hello, Win! Spinning, Win tore the withered edge from the page, feeling it crumble to dust in his sweaty palm. It was Annie, of course, coming down the narrow hall, shaking her pale hair free from her welding cap, all glimmering in the gaslights. Win clenched his fists, willing the energy to scatter. It was getting harder to control. The voice was getting louder too, as if furious at being smothered all these years. And that's where we're going to stop with the Time Speaker. I haven't read all of it yet. I've just read the beginning, but I am excited to read the rest of it. So we will now go to our feature presentation of Logan Reads Live Frightful Friday, which is, of course, returning to the turn of the screw. I'm going to be reading a couple chapters, chapters 6 and 7. The Turn of the Screw is, of course, written by Henry James. Chapter 6. It took, of course, more than that particular passage to place us together in presence of what we had now to live with as we could. My dreadful liability to impressions of the order so vividly exemplified, and my companion's knowledge, henceforth, a knowledge half consternation and half compassion of that liability. There had been, this evening, after the revelation that left me for an hour so prostrate, there had been, for either of us, no attendance on any service but a little service of tears and vows, of prayers and promises, a climax to the series of mutual challenges and pledges that had straightway ensued on our retreating together to the schoolroom and shutting ourselves up there to have everything out. The result of our having everything out was simply to reduce our situation to the last rigor of its elements. She herself had seen nothing, not the shadow of a shadow, and nobody in the house but the governess was in the governess's plight. Yet she accepted without directly impugning my sanity the truth as I gave it to her, and ended by showing me, on this ground, an awe-stricken tenderness, an expression of the sense of my more than questionable privilege, of which the very breath has remained with me as that of the sweetest of human charities. What was settled between us, accordingly, that night, was that we thought we might bear things together. And I was not even sure that, in spite of her exemption, it was she who had the best of the burden. I knew at this hour, I think, as well as I knew later, what I was capable of meeting to shelter my pupils. But it took me some time to be wholly sure of what my honest ally was prepared for to keep terms with so compromising a contract. I was queer company enough, quite as queer as the company I received, but as I trace over what we went through, I see how much common ground we must have found in the one idea that, by good fortune, could steady us. It was the idea, the second movement, that led me straight out, as I may say, of the inner chamber of my dread. I could take the air in the court, at least, and there Mrs. Gross could join me. Perfectly can I recall now the particular way strength came to me before we separated for the night. We had gone over and over every feature of what I had seen. He was looking for someone else, you say, someone who was not you. He was looking for little Miles. A portentous clearness now possessed me. That's whom he was looking for. But how do you know? I knew. My exaltation grew. And you know, my dear. She didn't deny this, but I required, I felt, not even so much telling as that. She resumed in a moment, at any rate. What if he should see him? Little Miles? That's what he wants. She looked immensely scared again. The child. Heaven forbid, the man. He wants to appear to them. That he might was an awful conception, and yet somehow I could keep it at bay, which, moreover, as we lingered there, was what I succeeded in practically proving. I had an absolute certainty that I should see again what I had already seen. But something within me said that by offering myself bravely as the sole subject of such experience, by accepting and by inviting, by surmounting it all, I should serve as the expiatory victim and guard the tranquillity of my companions, the children in especial. I should thus fence about and absolutely safe. I recall one of the last things I said that night to Mrs. Gross. It does strike me that my pupils have never mentioned. She looked at me hard as I musingly pulled up his having been here and the time they were with him. The time they were with him, and his name, his presence, his history in any way. Oh, the little lady doesn't remember. She never heard or knew. The circumstances of his death? I thought with some intensity. Perhaps not, but Miles would remember. Miles would know. Ah, don't try him, broke from Mrs. Gross. I returned her the look she had given me. Don't be afraid, I continued to think. It is rather odd that he has never spoken of him. Never by the least allusion. And you tell me they were great friends? Oh, it wasn't him, Mrs. Gross with emphasis declared. It was Quint's own fancy to play with him. I mean, to spoil him. She paused a moment, then she added, Quint was much too free. This gave me, straight from my vision of his face, such a face, a sudden sickness of disgust. Too free with my boy? Too free with everyone. I forbore for the moment to analyze this description further than by the reflection that a part of it applied to several of the members of the household, of the half dozen maids and men who were still of our small colony. But there was everything for our apprehension in the lucky fact that no discomfortable legend, no perturbation of scullions, had ever, with anyone's memory attached to the kind old place. It had, sorry, that was weird. Boy. Okay. It had neither bad name nor ill fame, and Mrs. Gross, most apparently, only desired to cling to me and to quake in silence. I even put her, the very last thing of all, to the test. It was when, at midnight, she had her hand on the schoolroom door to take leave. I have it from you, then, for it's of great importance, that he was definitely and admittedly bad. Oh, not admittedly. I knew it, but the master didn't. And you never told him. Well, he didn't like tale bearing. He hated complaints. He was terribly short with anything of that kind, and if people were all right to him, he wouldn't be bothered with more. This squared well enough with my impression of him. He was not a trouble loving gentleman, nor so very particular, perhaps, about some of the company he kept. All the same, I pressed my interlocutress. I promise you I would be told. She felt my discrimination. Or, sorry, I promise you I would have told. She felt my discrimination. I dare say I was wrong, but really I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of things that man can do. Quint was so clever. He was so deep. I took this in still more than probably I showed. You weren't afraid of anything else, not of his effect. His effect, she repeated with a face of anguish and waiting while I faltered. On innocent little precious lives. They were in your charge. No, they were not in mine, she roundly and distrustfully returned. The master believed in him and placed him here because he was supposed not to be well in the country air so good for him. So he had everything to say, yes. She let me have it, even about them. Them? That creature. I had to smother a kind of howl. And you could bear it. No, I couldn't, and I can't now. The poor woman burst into tears. A rigid control from the next day was, as I have said, to follow them. Yet, how often and how passionately for a week we came back together to the subject. Much as we had discussed it that Sunday night, it was in the immediate later hours in especial, for it may be imagined whether I slept, still haunted with the shadow of something she had not told me. I myself had kept back nothing, but there was a word Mrs. Gross had kept back. I was sure, moreover, by morning, that this was not from a failure of frankness, but because on every side there were fears. It seems to me, indeed, in retrospect, that by the time the morrow's sun was high, and I had restlessly read into the facts before us almost all the meaning they were to receive from subsequent and more cruel occurrences, what they gave me above all was just the sinister figure of the living man. The dead one would keep a while, and the months he had continuously passed at Bly, which added up made a formidable stretch. The limit of this evil time had arrived only when, on the dawn of a winter's morning, Peter Quint was found by a laborer going to early work, stone dead on the road from the village. A catastrophe explained, superficially at least, by a visible wound to his head. Such a wound as might have been produced, and as on the final evidence had been, by a fatal slip, in the dark and after leaving the public house, on a steepish icy slope, a wrong path altogether, at the bottom of which he lay. The icy slope, the turn mistaken at night and in liquor accounted for much. Practically, in the end, after the inquest and boundless chatter, for everything, but there had been matters in his life, strange passages and perils, secret disorders, vices more than suspected, that would have accounted for a good deal more. I scarce know how to put my story into words that shall be a credible picture of my state of mind, but I was in these days literally able to find a joy in the extraordinary flight of heroism and the occasion demanded of me. I now saw that I had been asked for a service admirable and difficult, and there would be a greatness in letting it be seen, oh, in the right quarter, that I could succeed where my many other girl might have failed. It was an immense help to me. I confess I rather applaud myself as I look back, that I saw my service so strongly and so simply. I was there to protect and defend the little creatures in the world, the most bereaved and most lovable, the appeal of whose helplessness had suddenly become only too explicit, a deep, constant ache of one's own committed heart. We were cut off, really, together. We were united in our danger. They had nothing but me, and well, I had them. It was, in short, a magnificent chance. This chance presented itself to me in an image richly material. I was a screen. I was to stand before them. The more I saw, the less they would. I began to watch them in a stifled suspense, a disguised excitement that might well, had it continued too long, have turned to something like madness. What saved me, as I now see, was that I turned to something else altogether. It didn't last as suspense. It was superseded by horrible proofs. Proofs, I say, yes, from the moment I really took hold. This moment dated from an afternoon hour that I happened to spend in the grounds with the younger of my pupils alone. We had left Miles indoors on the red cushion of a deep window seat. He had wished to finish a book, and I had been glad to encourage a purpose so laudable in a young man whose only defect was an occasional excess of restlessness. His sister, on the contrary, had been alert to come out, and I strolled with her half an hour, seeking the shade, for the sun was still high and the day exceptionally warm. I was aware afresh with her as we went of how, like her brother, she contrived, it was the charming thing in both children, to let me alone without appearing to drop me, and to accompany me without appearing to surround. They were never importunate, and yet never listless. My attention to them all really went to seeing them amuse themselves immensely without me. This was a spectacle they seemed actively to prepare, and that engaged me as an active admirer. I walked in a world of their invention. They had no occasion whatever to draw upon mine, so that my time was taken only with being, for them, some remarkable person or thing that the game of the moment required, and that was merely, thanks to my superior, my exalted stamp, a happy and highly distinguished sinecure. I forget what I was on the present occasion. I only remember that I was something very important and very quiet, and that Flora was playing very hard. We were on the edge of the lake, and as we had lately begun geography, the lake was the Sea of Azov. Suddenly, in these circumstances, I became aware that, on the other side of the Sea of Azov, we had an interested spectator. The way this knowledge gathered in me was the strangest thing in the world. The strangest, that is, except the very much stranger in which it quickly merged itself. I had sat down with a piece of work, for I was something or other I could sit, on the old stone bench which overlooked the pond. And in this position I began to take in with certitude, and yet without direct vision, the presence, at a distance, of a third person. The old trees, the thick shrubbery, made a great and pleasant shade, but it was all suffused with the brightness of the hot, still hour. There was no ambiguity in anything, none whatever, at least in the conviction I from one moment to another found myself forming as to what I should see straight before me and across the lake as the consequence of raising my eyes. They were attached, at this juncture, to the stitching in which I was engaged, and I can feel once more the spasm of my effort not to move them till I should so have steadied myself as to be able to make up my mind what to do. There was an alien object in view, a figure whose right of presence I instantly, passionately questioned. I recollect counting over perfectly the possibilities, reminding myself that nothing was more natural, for instance, than the appearance of one of the men about the place, or even of a messenger, a postman, or a tradesman's boy from the village. That reminder had as little effect on my practical certitude as I was conscious, still even without looking, of its having upon the character and attitude of our visitor. Nothing was more natural than these things should be the other things that they absolutely were not. Of the positive identity of the apparition, I would assure myself as soon as the small clock of my courage should have ticked out the right second. Meanwhile, with an effort that was already sharp enough, I transferred my eyes straight to little Flora, who at the moment was about 10 yards away. My heart had stood still for an instant with the wonder and terror of the question whether she too would see. And I held my breath while I waited for what a cry from her, what some sudden innocent sign, either of interest or of alarm, would tell me. I waited, but nothing came. Then, in the first place, and there is something more dire in this, I feel, than in anything I have to relate, I was determined by a sense that, within a minute, all sounds from her had previously dropped, and in the second, by the circumstance that, also within the minute, she had, in her play, turned her back to the water. This was her attitude when I at last looked at her. Looked with the confirmed conviction that we were still, together, under direct personal notice. She had picked up a small flat piece of wood, which happened to have in it a little hole that had evidently suggested to her the idea of sticking in another fragment that might figure as a mast and make the thing a boat. This second morsel, as I watched her, she had very markedly and intently attempted to tighten in its place. My apprehension of what she was doing sustained me so that after some seconds I felt I was ready for more. Then again I shifted my eyes. I faced what I had to face. Chapter 7. I got a hold of Mrs. Gross as soon after this as I could, and I can give no intelligible account of how I fought out the interval. Yet I still hear myself cry as I fairly threw myself into her arms. They know! It's too monstrous! They know! They know! And what on earth? I felt her incredulity as she held me. Why, all that we know, and heaven knows what else besides. Then she released me, and I made it out to her, made it out perhaps only now with full coherency, even to myself. 2 hours ago, in the garden, I could scarce articulate. Flora saw. Mrs. Gross took it as she might have taken a blow in the stomach. She has told you, she panted. Not a word. That's the horror. She kept it to herself. The child of 8, that child. Unutterable still, for me, was the stupefaction of it. Mrs. Gross, of course, could only gape the wider. Then how do you know? I was there. I saw with my eyes. I saw that she was perfectly aware. Do you mean aware of him? No, of her. I was conscious as I spoke that I looked prodigious things, for I got the slow reflection of them in my companion's face. Another person this time, but a figure of quite an unmistakable horror and evil, a woman in black, pale and dreadful, with such an air also, and such a face, on the other side of the lake. I was there with the child, quiet for the hour, and in the midst of it she came. Came how? From where? From where they can come from. She just appeared and stood there, but not so near, and without coming nearer. Oh, for the effect and the feeling, she might have been as close as you. My friend, with an odd impulse, fell back a step. Was she someone you've never seen? Yes, but someone the child has. Someone you have. Then, to show how I had thought it all out, my predecessor, the one who died. Miss Jessel. Miss Jessel. You don't believe me? I pressed. She turned right and left in her distress. How can you be sure? This drew from me, in the state of my nerves, a flash of impatience. Then ask Flora. She's sure. But I had no sooner spoken than I caught myself out. Hey, sorry. Then I caught myself up. No, for God's sake, don't. She'll say she isn't. She'll lie. Mrs. Gross was not too bewildered instinctively to protest. Ah, how can you? Because I'm clear. Flora doesn't want me to know. It's only then to spare you. No, no, there are depths, depths. The more I go over it, the more I see in it, and the more I see in it, the more I fear. I don't know what I don't see, but I don't fear. Mrs. Gross tried to keep up with me. You mean you're afraid of seeing her again? Oh no, that's nothing now. Then I explained, it's of not seeing her. But my companion only looked wan. I don't understand you. Why, it's that the child may keep it up, and that the child assuredly will without my knowing it. At the image of this possibility, Mrs. Gross for a moment collapsed, yet presently to pull herself together again, as if from the positive force of the sense of what, should we yield an inch, there would really be to give way to. Dear, dear, we must keep our heads. And after all, if she doesn't mind it, she even tried a grim joke. Perhaps she likes it. Likes such things, a scrap of an infant. Isn't it just a proof of her blessed innocence? My friend bravely inquired. She brought me, for the instant, almost round. Oh, we must clutch at that. We must cling to it. If it isn't proof of what you say, it's a proof of God knows what. For the woman's a horror of horrors. Mrs. Gross, at this, fixed her eyes a minute on the ground, then at last raising them, tell me how you know, she said. Then you admit it's what she was, I cried. Tell me how you know, my friend simply repeated. No, by seeing her, by the way she looked. At you, do you mean so wickedly? Dear me, no. I could have borne that. She gave me never a glance. She only fixed the child. Mrs. Rose tried to see it. Fixed her? Ah, with such awful eyes. She stared at mine as if they might really have resembled them. Do you mean of dislike? Do you mean of dislike? God help us, no, of something much worse. Worse than dislike. This left her indeed at a loss. With a determination indescribable, with a kind of fury of intention. I made her turn pale. Intention? To get a hold of her. Mrs. Gross, her eyes just lingering on mine, gave a shudder and walked to the window. And while she stood there looking out, I completed my statement. That's what Flora knows. After a little, she turned round. The person was in black, you say. In mourning, rather poor, almost shabby, but yes, with extraordinary beauty. I now recognized to what I had at last, stroke by stroke, brought the victim of my confidence, for she quite visibly weighed this. Oh, handsome, very, very, I insisted. Wonderfully handsome, but infamous. She slowly came back to me. Miss Jessel was infamous. She once more took my hand in both her own, holding it as tight as if to fortify me against the increase of alarm I might draw from this disclosure. They were both infamous, she finally said. So, for a little, we faced it once more together, and I found absolutely a degree of help in seeing it now so straight. I appreciate, I said, the great decency of your not having hitherto spoken. But the time has certainly come to give me the whole thing. She appeared to assent to this, but still only in silence, seeing which I went on. I must have it now. Of what did she die? Come, there was something between them. There was everything. In spite of the difference. Oh, of their rank, their condition. She brought it woefully out. She was a lady. I turned it over. I again saw, yes, she was a lady. And he was so dreadfully below, said Mrs. Gross. I felt that I doubtless needn't press too hard in such company on the place of a servant in the scale, but there was some but there was nothing to prevent an acceptance of my companion's own measure of my predecessor's abasement. There was a way to deal with that, and I dealt, the more readily for my full vision, on the evidence of our employer's late, clever, good looking own man, impudent, assured, spoiled, depraved. The fellow was a hound. Mrs. Gross considered, as if it were perhaps a little a case for a sense of shades. I've never seen one like him. He did what he wished. With her, with them all. It was as if now, in my friend's own eyes, Miss Jessel had again appeared. I seemed, at any rate for an instant, to see their evocation of her as distinctly as I had seen her by the pond, and I brought out with decision, it must have been also what she wished. Mrs. Gross's face signified that it had been indeed, but she said at the same time, poor woman, she paid for it. Then you do know what she died of? I asked. No, I know nothing. I wanted not to know. I was glad enough I didn't, and I thanked heaven she was well out of this. Yet you had then your idea of her real reason for leaving? Oh, yes, as to that, she couldn't have stayed, fancy it here, for a governess, and afterward I imagined, and I still imagine, and what I imagine is dreadful. Not so dreadful as what I do, I replied, on which I must have shown her, as I was indeed but too conscious, of affront, of miserable defeat. It brought out again all her compassion for me, and at the renewed touch of her kindness my power to resist broke down. I burst, as I had, the other time, made her burst, into tears. She took me to her motherly breast, and my lamentation overflowed. I don't do it, I sobbed in despair. I don't save or shield them. It's far worse than I dreamed. They're lost. And that concludes chapter 7. And I guess we just get to imagine what they imagined that Miss Jessel died of. I wonder if they just felt like they couldn't say because they didn't want it to be that kind of book, or if it's meant to be that the characters were unwilling to speak of it. Anyways, one of the things that happens in this book that trips me up sometimes, and I just want to mention, is the sentence the sentences are often incredibly long and complicated. That they'll have so many like commas and like little interjections in the sentences, and then they'll have those like dashes to represent a pause, and they can just go on and on for so long that it just is difficult to try to read aloud and make sure that you get the right inflection on each part. It's tricky. Anyways, thank you so much for coming and listening to Logan Reads Live tonight, which is presented by Rosalyn and Jane, where we are featuring the Miranda Jumpsuit, which is perfect for a day out or a special occasion. It features a wide leg, high neck, and long sleeve silhouette with an elegant and unique print. The design is flattering and comfortable, ensuring you look and feel your best. There is a link in the description where you can go and find the Miranda Jumpsuit. And of course, there is the link where you can find the Timespeaker, a dark fantasy story. All right. Thank you so much for coming. You have a lovely night and a lovely weekend, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.